Hello everyone. Today I'm going to comment on a discussion between Sargon and Rucka Rucka Ali. I think this is a week or two old, but I'm just getting around to it. Rucka is an objectivist, and he's trying to convert Sargon, or at least talk to him about it. And I thought, after watching it, that I would record my commentary on it. I'm using the same logic I do with my podcast. I would have done this anyway, pausing the video, speaking extemporaneously on what was said, but instead of doing that into the ether and letting the void be the only beneficiary, I figured I would record it and upload it to YouTube. So that's what I'm doing. The original video is an hour and 45 minutes long. The content I am commenting on is whittled down to 30 minutes. So don't get a skewed perspective on this. Remember that the clips I'm showing are not even half of their discussion. As for Rucka, he is not a philosopher, which he readily admits, and that's fine. I actually think he is the model for what most people should be. Most people can't be philosophers, and that's fine. They have their own things to do. But what people should do is recognize the value and truth in objectivism and then apply it to their lives, doing whatever it is they do. So that's exactly what he's done. And if everyone were like him, the world would be a hell of a lot better. So even though I'm going to criticize some things he says, I'm not trying to trash either of these two. It's just that he's not a philosopher, and, well, I am. So hopefully anybody who's interested in objectivism can benefit from my responses to what Sargon and he talked about. So let's get started.
Must have been a huge leap in your paradigm, though, to go from being a communist sympathizer to being a Randian objectivist.
Okay, so this is not the most substantial thing to start with, but it just makes me giggle when people use the term Randian objectivist, as if there are other kinds of prominent uses for the term objectivist. Yes, I know some people use it in different ways, but nobody's going to get confused. Anyway, that's just a minor point to start off.
Or if you think that, any objectivist commentator has misrepresented what, for instance, Kant has said, that's not on me. Make that point. By all means, all these ideas are open to scrutiny by nature.
There is a big debate about that, but I'm sure you already know.
So what is the debate?
Well, I was speaking to Gary Edwards, actually. He thought that Kant was defending reason rather than attacking it. But I was looking. I'm going to do a review of or an analysis of the ominous parallels, and I found Will Durant was a historian in 1913 or something who wrote a series of works on this, and he seems to think that Kant was attacking reason as well. So it's something I'm going to look into more because I haven't got to the end of the train of investigation.
Well, by the way, I think I just noticed I'm out of the shot this whole time.
Well, the first thing is that Will Durant is not a great historian of philosophy. He wrote an 11-volume series on the history of Western civilization. It's called The Story of Civilization. And he also wrote a single book called The Story of Philosophy. It's mediocre as far as histories of philosophy go. The two standards are for layman, W.T. Jones, A History of Western Philosophy, that is without question the best. I recommend it. And for advanced readers, Wilhelm Windelband's A History of Philosophy, with a special reference to its problems and conceptions. I think that's the whole title, but that is more advanced. Those are the two standards. Will Durant is, somebody once described him as not having standing in philosophy. He's okay, but as far as Kant and reason, I think Sargon especially is still infected with this culture of concrete boundedness, where all you can really say about a philosopher is what he explicitly stated. If he didn't say he was against reason, then, well, he's not against reason. I mean, what are you going to do, infer his motives behind the scenes or the effects? That's all abstraction. We can't get into all that. That's all subjective. But that's wrong. To determine whether Kant was for or against reason, you have to understand what reason is. You have to have your own philosophy, your own stance on reason. No investigation of Kant in isolation is going to determine this for you. You have to say, well, what is reason, and then what did Kant say? Now, the thing is, there is no such thing as a philosophy that explicitly rejects reason or the natural world. If they reject those things, they are not philosophies. They are religions, or organized religions. You could say very early religion is an innocent attempt to explain the natural world. But as soon as it gets codified, all religions become formalized rejections of reason and the natural world. And they cease to become philosophies. Now, philosophies can imply or implicitly depend upon mysticism and supernaturalism. Plato does that. Kant does that. But they at least practically use logic in order to explain their views. So, of course, you're not going to find anything in Kant that says, no, I'm throwing reason out completely, it doesn't matter. But Kant is attacking the substance of what reason really is. Here's what Kant did, and Kant is a genius. This is brilliant, but evil. And this is how he attacked reason. What Kant did was say, our perception of reality is processed by our sense organs, which had been a view throughout philosophy. But he said, also, our logic works the same way. It's artificial. It's imposed on reality by our mind. So there's nothing about logic that's necessarily true about the real world. But the only world we ever know is the processed world, processed through our sense organs and our mind, logic. So the world as it is the noumenal world. And the world as processed by us is the phenomenal world. Now, Kant had been inspired by Hume's radical empiricism, skepticism, to try to solve this problem, because Hume said, you know, you throw a rock up in the air 1,000,000 times, it falls back down every time, but the 1,000,001st time it might turn into an elephant and fly away. There is no way to predict anything. There is no law of identity. All we are just centers of experience, and things happen, and you have no way to predict what's going to happen next. Now, Kant's noumenal-phenomenal split gave him what he thought was the best of both worlds. On the one hand, it saves science and prediction, because if your mind imposes order on reality, you create reality, so you know what's coming next. You just have to know how the mind works. If the mind's creating reality, then you can predict it. So science and prediction and all of these ideas, all of that is saved. At the same time, you get to have a belief in free will, which Kant thought was irrational, and God, which Kant thought was irrational, but that's fine, because rationality has no bearing on the world as it is. That's just a human imposition on reality. So you get to have science and religion, reason and faith. So you see how brilliant this idea is. I mean, it's totally false, but that's what Kant was doing. But this destroys reason. It marks it as something that deals only with a false world that all human beings share as a kind of collective delusion, because we all have the same kinds of brain that impose the same kind of structure on reality. And then subsequent philosophers say, well, if we can't ever know anything about the noumenal world, just get rid of it, and there's only the phenomenal world. This is where social justice advocates come from, because they say there's only the male perspective, female perspective, white perspective, black perspective, rich perspective, poor perspective, and there is no common ground, there is no external world to which you can each appeal. There's just your perspective as a human being, so it's kind of balkanization of the phenomenal world. But anyway, that's what Kant did. So he is objectively anti-reason, although no actual philosopher comes fully out against reason. So you won't find that in him. You just have to understand what reason is to see how he eclipsed it historically.
So you enjoyed the book? Is that
I did. It was I think it was I think it's even so, like, for anyone who hasn't read it, 90% of it is Peikoff, who is a doctor of philosophy. So it's, you know, he's, you know, he spent his entire career as a philosopher. He's got a doctorate in it. So even if you're not an objectivist, there is a great deal of value to be gained from it, because he spends a lot of time charting the philosophical structures of the philosophies involved, even if he doesn't agree with them. He still, I think he is accurately representing them, at least to the degree that I've investigated it and found that there are other people who I respect who have confirmed, you know, this is a thing. It's like I said, it's something I'm gonna have to look into more. And
I reject the credentialism we just saw Sargon express. If you know anything about how universities work today, you know they are almost nakedly irrational. Not quite, but the idea that Peikoff is respectable because he has a PhD is ridiculous. I mean, Peikoff himself would reject that. Peikoff actually left teaching and the university system because he couldn't stay in it. He knew he wouldn't be able to get by because of their irrational rules. Specifically, they don't care about quality but quantity, and he couldn't output garbage he wasn't willing to do that in order to stay in the good graces of academia. So he left. In fact, he said even his dissertation to get his PhD was just total garbage. He said he defined it in his mind as meaningless garbage and then just wrote it and filled it with really long quotes in Greek just to fill out the pages. So the idea that somebody has a PhD is respectable for that reason is false. Actually, I think there's a generational degradation within the objectivist movement that can largely be attributed to the Ayn Rand Institute and mainstream objectivism's obsession with staying in the university system. Ayn Rand herself said she would never be able to be published in an academic journal because she's too good. And Peikoff faced the same thing. He got into academia but couldn't stay in. Now, today, if you know the kind of objectivists who are still in academia, they are not firebrands like Peikoff and Rand. They are duller. They are less insightful. I mean, it takes its toll. If you subordinate yourself to the requirements of staying in academia, that has its price. And I think you can see that with all objectivists after Leonard Peikoff and Harry Binswanger. Sadly. Except for me, because I'm not in academia.
He spends a lot of time charting like the intellectual development. And he had one phrase that really rang with me, that it resonated. He was like, ideas are the motor of history. And that is a great phrase, because I'm so sick of people just dismissing the fact that the things people think are the reason that they do anything. And so many people, I mean, the regressive left will do this with Islam all the time. You know, oh no, it's the drone strikes in the in Pakistan. And then you have, like, the Islamic State's magazine directly addressing this argument, saying, no, even if you stop drone striking, even if you leave us alone completely, we will still hate you, we are still compelled to fight you because you are not Muslims. And so you can't get away from the fact that that idea is going to forever inspire terrorism.
Yeah, but yes, and that's the improv. You say yes, and you don't just contradict. But there's a lot there. But first of all, not every individual person is driven by ideas, and what I mean is a lot of people, they just kind of follow what they see people doing.
Yeah, I was speaking of intellectual trends.
What shapes a culture is the ideas of the intellect. You can trace it back to the intellectuals, the religious leaders, which of course are in their own way intellectual. The thinkers, the people who do think about ideas, the conclusions they arrive on end up spilling over into the culture, which shapes the culture, which shapes politics as well. Politics, they say is downstream from culture.
There would be no point having intellectuals and academics and public debates if these things didn't influence people.
Well, some people think there is no point because they do see.
Well, they do. You're right.
They see. So you said, well, the people are driven by Islam, right? And then others say,
people, obviously.
Right, and then others say, no, that's not it. It's their conditions. It's whatever it is that causes them to behave they do. Whatever.
Leaders are driven by ideas. Followers are driven by conditions, I think.
But
people are driven by ideas. It's not just intellectuals. Intellectuals uniquely create ideas, but everyone is driven by ideas. So I'm not quite sure what he was trying to get at here, and I'm not quite sure what the conditions comment meant, but it's not true that the average person just doesn't have anything to do with ideas. No. They're driven by ideas, intellectuals are driven by ideas, everybody is driven by ideas. The question is, are you helplessly in their power, or are you investigating them yourself? John Maynard Keynes said that most people who believe themselves to be practical and exempt from ideas are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. That's a paraphrase. Now, the truth is, just replace economist with philosopher. Philosophers rule the world, and people act on the basis of the ideas they absorb through the transmission belt of the culture. Movies, books, video games, the news, stand-up comedians, they are the transmission belts of the philosophers. They transmit these ideas into the average person, and the average person acts on the basis of those ideas. The only difference is they don't examine them, and they're not originators. In effect, you could say philosophers and intellectuals, they create the menu, and average people just choose from the menu. They don't have the option of adding things to the menu. But whether you're creating the menu or simply choosing from a menu created by somebody else, everyone has to choose something from the menu. Everybody is run by ideas.
So my main thing is not so much to argue that we need to argue about what drives Pakistanis to blow shit up, but what do we have in return to respond to that? And when we're living in a culture where you've got guys like Brett Weinstein, the current golden boy, the current trophy of the free speech movement, he believes that culture is biological. I heard him say that, and he's not alone in that. I mean,
the alt-right think that.
The alt-right and the left and everyone in between seems to think that. I mean, you mentioned Peterson earlier at lunch. Does he believe we're kind of basically fully biological?
I don't think so. I mean, I've not heard him cover it, but I would be surprised if that fit in with his world philosophy.
I mean,
I don't know why you'd be surprised unless you were totally unfamiliar with him, because that fits in perfectly with his philosophy. Peterson is a radical pragmatist. He believes that truth is nested in biology and evolution and what works for the survival of the human race. Peterson is absolutely one of these people. He thinks it's all a product of biology. And maybe we can use reason around the fringes sometimes, but really we should defer to the innate ideas we've developed through this evolutionary psychology voodoo, because it's been around a lot longer than us, and what the hell do we know? We're just rational beings, and evolution is a hell of a lot smarter than our rational mind. So be irrational, just follow your gut feeling, because it's a product of biology. So yes, Jordan Peterson is exactly one of these people. The praise for Jordan Peterson disgusts me. He is an Eastern mystic, pragmatist. I mean, he is a ridiculous, comical configuration of false viewpoints. I mean, if you were just trying to create somebody with the worst possible ideas, it would actually be difficult to come up with somebody worse than Jordan Peterson.
Prevailing kind of view of people is that we're shaped by biology, whether it's IQ, it's our genes, it's or even people say we're products of our environment, but you know, our culture at large is biological, right? Like, I mean, you hear this everywhere. You know, Dr. Drew, the addiction specialist, the guy who has spent his career watching drug addicts take matters into their hands and follow instructions and make choices that would lead them to sobriety. A nearly impossible feat. Even he talks about culture as in, like, why did we evolve this way? And you know, you see this shit everywhere.
You do see this everywhere. This is the evolutionary psychology voodoo I just mentioned. In their confused struggle to fight subjectivism, people are turning toward evolutionary psychology and evolution itself as a form of intrinsicism, as a form of non-rational, non-volitional reality thrust upon us. We don't have free will. We don't really have ideas, because ideas would be inherently subjective. So what we really have are ideas that are forced on us by nature, and that's the only way we can trust them. So yes, I agree with Rucka entirely. This is everywhere, and it is false.
I mean, listen, genes do exist, right? Like, some people are going to be better at basketball, some are going to be more intellectual than others, some are going to be better at math, some are going to be more kind of just overall cerebral.
And there are going to be average differences among population groups.
Yeah,
you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, by all means, if you happen to be born Chinese, be happy that you're good at math. Don't fucking try to run from it and say, oh no, that black guy over there would be just as good at math if he was raised by my parents. It's like, no, you're a bad driver and you're good at math. Just fucking take it. Just fucking run with it.
Genes do exist and they do matter, but I think people greatly overestimate their importance in intellectual matters. People think of intelligence as genetically based, and your brain is physical and is clearly the physical side of your mind, the physical entity that gives rise to your mind, but I actually don't think the differences between human beings, non-retarded human beings, are that different. I highly doubt there is a significant congenital difference in the mathematical potential of some Chinese guy and some black guy.
Again, the question that ultimately it boils down to is, do you believe people have free will? Do you think their actions are predetermined or not? Because I say they're not predetermined. You do have free will. And we live in a time when the existence of free will is very much either in question or completely dismissed, both by psychologists and thinkers in every department. And predetermination is wildly kind of entertained, if not completely accepted. So,
I don't know how widespread it is, but there are definitely people who are like that, and I find that disturbing, because I think even if let's assume that there is no free will, it is all predetermined. I think there's still a lot of value in the idea that it's not, because if you tell people, oh, everything's predetermined, so don't do anything, people aren't going to do anything, and that's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're going to be like, well, what can I do? Everything's already determined for me. I may as well not try.
Yeah.
Well, if there is no free will, then it doesn't matter what you say or do because you have no choice over it. So there's no use in worrying about anything. But the important thing here is that free will does exist. This is, I think, the hardest issue, just the hardest issue, not in philosophy or anything. This is the hardest issue for people to wrap their minds around, because it involves both of the primary methodological mistakes people make. it relies on both rationalism and a lack of introspection. That deadly combination is formidable. Anyway, if you're interested in this, I recommend you look up my podcast episode on free will and look forward to my forthcoming book, which will cover it in one of its sections. And you can look up the existing objectivist literature.
And this is like the sort of quest for objectivity, you know. The regressive left will tell you, oh, well, there is no perfect objectivity, so we should just content to be subjective. And it's like, yeah, but that's taking the path of least resistance. The value is not in actually being objective, but in trying to be objective. It's the journey rather than the destination. Because if you try your hardest to be as objective as you possibly can, you will produce a better content of, say, a quality of journalism than if you were to just go, you know what, I embrace my subjectivity, I embrace my irrationalism, fuck it all, and you're going to become a partisan propagandist who has absolutely no value to their product.
The value is in the destination, and not the journey. In fact, there is no such thing as the journey without the destination. A journey means a journey to somewhere. There's no such thing as getting closer to objectivity if it doesn't exist. The same way there's no such thing as getting closer to creating a square circle if a square circle doesn't exist, and it doesn't. Objectivity is possible and necessary. But Sargon is going to talk more about this later, so I will wait until then to comment further on this issue. But I just wanted to bring up the irrationality of the idea of getting closer to an impossible ideal.
It's true, though.
Everything you guys rail against, all you anti-SJWs, all that, you hate the Young Turks, you hate fucking identity politics, supposedly you hate it, even if I would say you kind of take part of it in your own way.
We do not.
Okay, we'll get to that.
But yeah, okay, we'll get to that.
But, you guys were all fucking on board with this shit till they came after your video games. I swear to God, I hated the Young Turks 10 years ago. I fucking hated them.
You were hating the Young Turks before it was cool.
Long before it was cool. I don't like these guys were such smug assholes. They're the most unlikable people on earth. I hated them. And they made me never want to watch anything on YouTube. I was like, if this shit exists, like, then watching YouTube is not going to do anything for my positive outlook of the world.
He's right here, specifically in the idea that they are obviously smug morons. And if you don't recognize that, even if you're on the left or you're non-political, there's something wrong there. I recognized what was wrong with Jimmy Dore and Jank and Kasparian and all these people. There's something wrong with them. There's something off-putting and ugly about their personality. You don't even have to know their ideas. If you're an honest person, you haven't really thought about politics yet, but you're an honest person, you can just see in their mannerisms, the way they move, the way they discuss things, there's something off and ugly about it, and irrational, and nihilistic. And it doesn't take being politically engaged to see that. So I'm suspicious of anyone who doesn't notice things like that.
Yeah, I don't
It's
know.
nothing
It's
serious.
stupid.
It is,
Yeah, but like,
yeah,
what, by
yeah,
the
it's
way,
stupid.
all you guys who hate what the gaming industry
But I
is
thought you were
doing.
down about the principles. That's the thing. It's the principle of the thing. They don't have a right to just sit there and go, you know what, we don't like what you've said, so we're going to remove it.
Well, they literally have that right because it's their game.
Yeah, but it's the spirit of the thing and the principles that they're following.
I mean,
It's not the spirit of the thing. The spirit of free speech is that you get to use your property as you want. Free speech includes the right to withhold your property or platform from being used to spread ideas you disagree with. It doesn't violate the spirit of free speech at all to say this platform can only be used for ideas that agree with me. Of course, there's also a value to forums that allow a range of ideas to be expressed, but the idea that, well, the First Amendment and the idea of free speech, more broadly, the spirit there is to allow the largest number of ideas to be spread, that's false. It is crucial to free speech that somebody have the right to say, I support this, and I'm only allowing my property to be used to support this, and not that.
It seems that what you're doing is effectively trying to... I think you're concerned about over-regulation of business, right?
Or regulation of it altogether.
Or regulation of it altogether. I disagree. I think there are definitely certain basic standards of regulation that have to be met, but beyond that, beyond sort of safety measures, I don't see the need to regulate necessarily.
Well, the fact that you give them this much allows them to get to this much.
Well, if you're permissive of that,
Yeah, you see Sargon's response here, and Sargon's response is actually rational given what Rucka said. If the idea is that, well, it makes sense to have this little regulation, but we can't do it because it just inevitably leads to more, well, that's ridiculous. Then you just explain to people why this much makes sense and no more does. So Sargon's response here is totally valid. The proper response to this objection is that any amount of regulation is bad. Not that a little is okay, but it inevitably leads to more. No, a little bit is bad. And what's important to understand is that a moderate position, a mix of good and bad, is radioactive. There is no logic by which you can justify a little bit of bad. If regulation is good, let's have more of it. That's why it always spreads out of control. If regulation is bad, let's have none of it. This is why accepting a little bit always leads to more, because even the little bit is bad. So the fundamental and crucial point to make is that even that little bit is bad. But once you say it's good, you're accepting the principle of regulation. So by logic, by consistency, it's going to spread out of control. That's the response to that, not because it's going to spread out of control for some other unknown reason.
There are times where corporate power is used inappropriately, and that would, I think, generally be called corruption.
Yeah, you mean
for example, I mean, you've got the example of the United Fruit Company, who went into Guatemala and bought up 43% of the land from under the feet of the peasants who owned it, because they bought out the government.
So what's the solution to that?
Well, the government is weak and corrupt.
Yeah, there's no concept of property rights. So those peasants they're basically treated like dominoes. Yeah.
And it would be up to the peasants to resist the government. This is the thing. The United Fruit Company, corporations are always going to try and do something if they can.
Look,
companies are not necessarily always going to try something. Companies are just made up of people, and people have ideas. Do you think a CEO would murder someone just because he could make a profit on it? No. Because CEOs are just people, and they believe in morality just like everyone else. Now, to the extent that they do try, it's still the government's responsibility. Now, I don't mean to analogize this to a parent and child in the sense that a parent knows better, but I do mean it in the sense that a parent has the power. The government has the power. It's the monopoly on force. A company can't do anything to you unless the government backs it up. A company can't force the government to do anything, so any problem like this is fundamentally the fault of the government. But beyond that, in its context, the United Fruit Company did the best it could.
Sure, but I don't think that the government should be bailing out banks or big business. If they're going to fail, they should fail, and in their place, other entrepreneurs will rise and build something. Hopefully. For example, in the UK, they kept going on, what if we don't give huge tax breaks and subsidies to Starbucks, they'll leave. And it's like, okay, let them leave. It's not like people will say, well, you know what, I just don't want coffee anymore. It'll be small coffee shops that spring up, and it'll be small businessmen, and they will, enrich themselves, and then people will, the process will start again.
You think
that's not necessarily true. I'm sure in that case it's true that somebody would rise up to provide coffee, but that kind of thinking is flawed. You can't think in terms of, well, if the government doesn't subsidize this, somebody else will provide this exact same thing. That's not necessarily the case. The government could steal a bunch of money and spend it on something not worthwhile. So, say a space program back when that was not a rational investment, maybe it's still not a rational investment. Well, if you cut government funding for that, It's not necessarily true that, I mean, in that context, somebody's not going to come along and fund a space program. But you can't then think, well, then I guess we need the government. No. Because what you have to understand is that a space program is not then worth it to individuals freely choosing their own values. So it's dangerous to think in terms of, well, if the government doesn't do this, somebody else will come along and provide the exact same thing. That's not necessarily true. What is true is that they will come along and provide what is, in aggregate, the values of all the individuals transacting with one another.
Like that,
There is absolutely no argument of capitalism, because otherwise the alternative is to not own your own property, as in you as the property. You are your own means of production. I mean, we are independent YouTubers and content creators. We are the method of production. If it wasn't for you, you would have nothing. You know, you can't expect someone else to make Rucka Rucka Ali songs. You know, only you are capable. You are the means of production. You are actually living the Marxist dream, believe it or not. But
how's that?
Because it's a long story. I'm not going to go into it.
Right.
But basically, there's you are the means of production. So you're not owned by a businessman. Someone else is exploiting your labor.
Last time
you're exploiting your own labor. But that can only happen when you have self ownership. And like all these collectivists, the socialists, the statists, as Randians would say, that you don't have self ownership. You fundamentally are not in possession.
So
of your
why?
Sargon is big on this theory of self-ownership because he's read Locke, and this comes from Locke largely, but this is a false theory. Self-ownership is a false theory. First of all, it's mystical in a certain sense because Locke's idea is that we are the property of God, and therefore if you violate other people's rights, you're really violating God's property rights. But even outside of the mystical, the idea that you own yourself and therefore somebody else attacking you or violating your rights is wrong on the basis of property rights, that's wrong. Property, the right to property is the right to the material consequences of the action that produced that property. Property is derived from liberty, which is itself derived from life, the rights to all these things. If you're going to live, you need to be able to take actions in support of your life. And in order for those actions to be meaningful, for them to actually support your life, you need the right to the material consequences of those actions. Now, if you take property as primary, and then derive liberty from it, as if an assault on your liberty is bad because it's an assault on your right to the property of yourself, then you get into this circular reasoning, or else just an arbitrary, unjustified statement. Because if you say liberty is justified by property, well then you can't say property is justified by liberty. Okay, so then how do you justify property? Well, you don't. There is no answer, because property is actually justified by liberty. So that's what's wrong with this. And the idea is just incoherent. How can you own you? You can't be the thing owning itself. This whole idea was pushed because property rights used to be stronger, and so people thought, okay, if we define freedom in terms of property, that'll make it safer, but you see how respected property is today. So that didn't work. And the thing to understand is that fundamentally it didn't work because it's not true.
Like, Bruce Wayne is like the only billionaire I can think of who's presented as a good guy, and even
he's a bad guy. I hate.
Well, even
Bruce Wayne.
He's presented as kind of like a conflicted.
He is actually a bad guy. I mean, if Bruce Wayne genuinely wanted to do good, he would put his money into, like, charity, or into the, he'd give the police force the resources they needed to actually combat the crime wave that's constantly afflicting Gotham. Not getting out in a bat suit and beating up low vigilante justice.
That's.
Well, leaving out the charity part, this is literally true. Vigilantism is not justified, at least not in normal circumstances. But Batman is art. The whole point of Batman is to stylize objectivity. He's in a situation where he's taking the law into his own hands, but drawing an objective line in the form of not killing people. It's a way of exaggerating his commitment to objectivity, even in a context where he doesn't have to be, or really where most people wouldn't. They think, well, if I'm not going to follow the rules anymore, I'm just going to do whatever the hell I want and be like the Joker. But this is the difference between Batman and the Joker. Batman he independently understands, not just for social reasons, but by his own independent mind, understands the need for principles, which the Joker rejects. And that's the clash. And that's how this is stylized and exaggerated and emphasized in Batman. He's a vigilante who won't kill. Wow, that seems like an interesting clash, but it's not really a contradiction. It's there for emphasis.
But just to insert, and that's not to say that if Bill Gates didn't exist and Microsoft didn't exist, someone wouldn't take the place. They would, but they would just be in the same position that we are now considering Bill Gates to be. It's still a good thing that, whatever replacement in an alternate dimension where Bill Gates didn't exist, whoever else had thought of the same thing.
I mean, look, I'm not a big fan of hypotheticals. I hope that someone else would take this internet.
I
hope someone would recognize this internet technology as something great to put in everyone's home, just like Henry Ford put a car in everyone's garage. I hope so, but for now we're living in the timeline where it was Bill Gates.
Yeah.
How is he seen? Is he seen as an altruist? No, he's seen as a self-centered, selfish in a bad way businessman who, again,
he's actually a massive philanthropist.
Well, first of all, it's true that Bill Gates exists and existed in a factual context, so somebody else could have come along and did what he did, but it could have been later, and therefore would have meant a loss of value. And it's not even necessarily true that somebody would have come along. I mean, the Romans had something like steam power, and that didn't get developed for a couple thousand years. But even if somebody else would have come along, what's important is still that somebody had to do it. Some great man had to do it. So you can't say, well, somebody else would have done it, so therefore it doesn't matter. No, you still needed a great mind to put this into practice. Now, the whole philanthropy thing, I'm going to do an episode at some point on how Bill Gates is destroying the world through philanthropy. I hate when billionaires or rich people of any kind give away their money. Even just on, utilitarian grounds. You are destroying things. You are destroying wealth. Did Bill Gates do more for the world by donating to charity or by creating Windows? Did Steve Jobs do more for the world by creating the iPhone or by donating to the poor? By creating the iPhone, because even a lot of the poor have iPhones. Investment does more for people, if that's your standard, which I don't think it should be, but even if your standard is, well, what does the most for people, for other people, for people in general? Investment. Investment does way more than charity. And when you give away your billions to charity, you are destroying you're destroying saved up wealth, which could be put into production, or it could be immediately consumed and produce nothing in the long run. So what you're doing when you donate to charity is you are destroying that wealth. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily be if the charity were rational, but most charities are not rational. And just the idea that investing it is just, oh, well, that's obviously not as good of an idea. No, that's a really good idea. Because whoever invested in Steve Jobs and Bill Gates did a hell of a lot more good for the world than they would have done by giving that money to charity. So whenever you see somebody giving money to charity, these billionaires giving their money to charity, what you should be thinking is how much wealth they're just throwing away. They're destroying values.
They want to do
I don't even know if I would agree that everyone is self-interested. I mean, many people are suicidal. Many people have throughout history prevented themselves from succeeding. I mean, in parts of Asia where they've taken these Oriental philosophies very seriously, they're all laying in the sun waiting to die.
That's right, but self-interest doesn't necessarily mean material gain.
No, well, if
self-interest, for example, in like the 2nd century AD, you had like the Stylites, the Christian monks, ascetics, who would literally go sit on a pillar in the middle of the desert.
Yeah.
That's their own self-interest. They want to do that. As far as they're concerned, they're communing with God.
Okay.
They're getting close. They're not concerned with material goods,
Yeah.
but if you were to put them to work in a factory, they'd be like terribly depressed. So they'd be like, okay, I'm getting rich. I'm making stuff. I'm getting rich, but that's not interesting to them. That's not what they want.
And
so you're going against their self-interest, even if they're getting rich and famous and powerful.
And now, so my understanding is that Kant wanted to get rid of that. He wanted to get rid of the pursuit of values qua the pursuit of values. So even if you're a conscious altruist who is pursuing the idea, who's pursuing the giving, the sacrifice, and wants to give, he says, no, the fact that you even want to do it, that's your value, negates its virtue.
Yeah, you're doing it for the end in and of itself.
You should just do it because it's your duty and not even be happy that you're doing it, not even feel good about it.
Right.
Yes, Kant believed that if you do something for any kind of self-interested reason, even the desire to feel good about yourself for having done something moral, that you get no moral credit for that. In his terms, the sense of duty must have been sufficient to cause the action. This is translated from German, so I'm not really sure whether to call that a paraphrase, but that was the substance of what he was saying. If it was the right thing to do, but you only did it because you got this extra sense of goodness on top, it's not moral. You can still get the sense of goodness and get credit for it, but only if you would have done it anyway. So the sense of duty must have been sufficient to determine the action. Now I just want to comment on this idea that these self-flagellating religious people were not depressed. Sargon says they would have been depressed if you put them in a factory and forced them to create wealth. Well, they were certainly depressed already, because what they were doing was antithetical to happiness. What they were doing causes depression, and this is the crux of the issue. I really wish Rucka had explained this. I don't know if he knows the point well enough, but this is just a classic point, a common point. I mean, you will encounter this everywhere if you try to explain objectivism to people. And it's this idea of psychological hedonism. It's this conflation of motivated action with selfish action. And Sargon's mixing it up here with the idea that, well, values can be spiritual, which he thinks of as necessarily subjective, and so, therefore, whatever you choose to do is selfish. That's not right. You have to think of selfishness in objective terms. What actually benefits your life? You can analogize this to health. So, the self-flagellating Christians would be the equivalent of somebody who refuses to eat. Now, refusing to eat is not healthy just because you chose to do it. And on the flip side, eating 10 pieces of cake is not healthy just because you felt like it. Healthy is objective. Health is determined by what foods and activities will result in your body's continued full functioning. That's the standard of health. So the important thing to note here, or to understand, is just that there are different kinds of action. Like, you can't say chopping off your arm is selfish just because it's motivated. You know, chopping off your arm is just as selfish as not chopping off your arm and working out to make your arm stronger. Those are not the same thing. Now, motivated action is a valid concept, but on another level, it's also valid to distinguish between those actions that result in your own benefit and those that don't. And it's perfectly possible for you to consciously say, I am going to do what is against my own objective self-interest. And chopping off your arm, in most cases, maybe not if you're stuck under a boulder, is one of those actions. This is the difference between self-sacrifice and hedonism. Neither are selfish, but self-sacrifice is conscious, whereas hedonism is evasive. You don't even think about what you're doing if you're being hedonistic. You just do whatever you feel like, even though it's against your long-term self-interest. But if you're being self-sacrificial, you're thinking explicitly about what you're doing, but you're doing it against your own interest. And then there's self-interest, which is thinking explicitly about doing what's in your self-interest. So selfishness is really the union of explicit thought and the aim at what is good for you. And fundamentally, explicit thought is good for you.
You know, I saw you on Crowder saying that, I think it was toward the end of your interview, you just mentioned the Enlightenment values and that, you know, these Enlightenment values are a good thing that are being under attack. And I believe I remember his reaction, which is kind of like very kind of lukewarm about it.
It was. I expected him to be stronger on
well, your expectation is the mother of disappointment or whatever the fuck
ups or whatever.
Yeah. Well, but here's the thing. Guys like Crowder, Ben Shapiro, certainly Prager, these guys are very lukewarm about the Enlightenment. They see it as a very mixed bag because it definitely carved a stake through the heart of religion.
Oh, yeah.
And they try to make the Enlightenment all about Kant. They want to point to Kant and say, see what the Enlightenment did?
He's right. These religious conservatives are not hot on the Enlightenment. Peterson is one of them, and everybody he mentioned, Shapiro, Prager, Crowder, because it is the antithesis of religion. But Rucka's getting something wrong here. He's naively attributing to them the objectivist view. Like, everybody understands how evil Kant was, and it's a fight over what camp to put him in, so as to who gets the blame. Like, oh no, he was Enlightenment, so therefore the Enlightenment gets the blame. Oh no, he was defending religion, so religious people get the blame. That's not how they think. They take credit for Kant. They understand what he actually was. They don't see him as bad. They understand he was a defender of religion. Ben Shapiro says he's one of his favorite philosophers. I've heard Dinesh D'Souza, you know him, big religious Christian conservative. He uses Kant in his arguments, and exactly the points you would think, too. So, I mean, there's just a straight line. These people like Kant because he was eclipsing the Enlightenment. They don't identify him as bad and put that on us. They're actually not that sophisticated because they don't see all of the implications of Kant's ideas, because they don't see all the implications of religion. They think they can have their cake and eat it too. They think they can have faith and also capitalism and penicillin and anesthetic and everything else. Anesthetic, by the way, was fought by religious people because God said, thou shalt suffer. So who are you to circumvent the mechanisms of pain God put in your body? That story just always disgusts me.
So, I mean, I would say Aristotle introduced a mode of thinking which said that, you know, A is A. That was his big. A is A. You know, everything is what it is. The law of identity. Mm-hmm. So you learn through your senses. You identify things. You know that you exist because that's your axiom. That's self-evident. Yeah. And then you kind of build your way up from there. And as far as what you should do, which is ethics, what should I do? Like, what should I do right now? Should I be on the floor? Should I be sitting here? Should I be talking? Should I be driving off a cliff? You have to ask the main question, and this is Ayn Rand expanding on Aristotle. So Aristotle said, my understanding of Aristotle is, he said, the purpose of morality, the purpose of ethics is flourishing. The beneficiary of morality is the person practicing it. Does that sound like the contemporary view of morality? Does that sound like, when people say he's a good person, do they mean he's a guy who's flourishing? I mean, sometimes they do.
I'm not even sure if that's... I don't think that's comprehensive enough, because the beneficiary of morality is also the people who are not acted upon in a negative way. For example,
Okay, like
you find it immoral to pull out a knife and stab me, and therefore I benefit from not being stabbed because you find that immoral. So
okay,
it's not entirely on the person. There is also
the
people they're interacting with.
I'm not smart enough to respond to that.
Actually, it was Antonius Andreas, a medieval philosopher, who first formulated the law of identity in terms of A is A. Now, this is implicit in Aristotle. Obviously, logic depends on it, especially the law of non-contradiction. But as far as we can tell, A is A is not in any of his surviving works. Now, it's plausible it's in some of his works that didn't survive, of which there are apparently a great many. Cicero says his writing was like rivers of gold. And if you know anything about Aristotle's surviving work, it does not read like rivers of gold. So there's obviously a lot we don't have. But as far as we have actual evidence for, it was this guy, Antonius Andreas. So, just a minor point. Second, yes, Aristotle was an egoist, and he believed that the purpose of action and morality was eudaimonia, which means something like happiness or human flourishing. So, that's true. But now this point they make at the end here about, or that Sargon tries to make about morality benefiting other people. Well, yeah, of course it does. Because we're all rational human beings. What's good for me is good for you. Everybody should understand that, I mean, if your neighbor gets richer, that's good for you in a million ways. He can loan you money, he's a positive example, just a million different things. But the point they're getting confused here on, and it's, if you rewatch this, you'll see it's because of how Rucka said it. He kind of implied that the result of morality is the good of the beneficiary, but the result is the good of everybody. But the point, the purpose, the motivation should be the point of the individual taking the action. The point he's trying to make here is the only legitimate basis for action is the good of the person taking the action. Now, of course, that results in good for other people, which is even better for the person taking the action, but that should be the motivation, the good of the person taking the action.
Again, context. If it's based on your actual ability and your achievements, you should be proud of being a better Sargon than anyone else.
Absolutely, but I don't need to say that because it'll be self-evident from the sort of the way this is the Aristotelian way of looking at things. You are what you repeatedly do.
Sure.
And so I don't need to sit there and aggrandize myself saying, "Hey, look at what I do. Look at how the views I get. Look at this." That doesn't. I don't need to lord that over other people. And
no. I never said anything about other people.
I know you didn't. That's the thing. But that's what Christianity I think was trying to get away from. The sort of the natural tendency for people who are less well thought through in their philosophy to build their ego, to place themselves above other people, because
this is wrong. This is a whitewashing of Christianity and history. Jordan Peterson does this too with the idea of sacrifice. Peterson rightly recognizes that the idea of forestalled benefit, of long-range action, which may mean doing something you don't immediately feel like doing for the greater benefit of something to come in the future, is the essence of civilization, and that's what's at the base of all human goodness. But he identifies the Christian idea of sacrifice this way. That is obviously not what they meant, and not how it was interpreted. I think its plausibility had to do with that, but it's a conflation, and the negative elements are what get emphasized. It's kind of an ossified, primitive version of the idea of investment. They think, well, it seems like forestalling gratification, putting it off, results in good things, so then they just take that as an intrinsic virtue. That's the most benevolent interpretation you can give, but I don't even think that applies to a great many religious people throughout history, including many alive today. But this is just another example of that, the attack on pride, as if it's motivated by an actual concern with what's wrong with pride. Again, that gets its plausibility, but the fundamental motivation here is a metaphysical and epistemological motivation. It's, you have no basis for pride because you are a sinful, lowly, corrupt, deranged human being, and you cannot compare with the infinite. So pride is totally unjustified. It is not an attempt to guard against the excesses of hubris, although that is what makes the idea plausible to the gullible.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's about not about it's not about sort of a form of social aggression using your pride to say I'm better than you, which is the Young Turks in a nutshell, and it's sad watching that happen when you don't need that to happen. It's definitely something innate to human psychology, and I think that's what Christianity was trying to avoid. And I understand that 2,000 years ago, when moral philosophy was far less well developed, this would have been a useful thing to have. Especially if you're under the Romans and they're erecting giant statues of themselves. It's like, okay, but why does this guy need a statue?
The Romans were drifting farther away from Aristotle and closer to Plato, and eventually Christianity, which is a very Platonic religion, even if the Israelites were obviously different, separate from the Greeks, but the ideas behind Jesus' words were very Platonic, just that there's that kingdom of heaven out there, and you need to follow God's instructions. I
agree. I think it's very much more Aristotelian because, give away your possessions. It's the things you're doing that make you the good Christian. Like Jesus saying, go and pray in your closet.
In that regard, it's in some ways Christianity is a Western religion. Everything about the West is a mixture of Aristotle and Plato.
But I think Christianity is very much influenced by Aristotle.
Maybe very much, but it's overwhelmingly Platonic because the truth is out there. You've seen Aristotle and Plato standing side by side in that Michelangelo painting, and Plato's pointing up to the sky, and Aristotle is pointing to the ground. That's Western history for you. It's all been Aristotle versus Plato, and the stuff that we don't like, religious dogma. In my case, sacrifice for no good reason, which is what makes it sacrifice. If it had a good reason, it wouldn't be a sacrifice.
I think is that true?
Let's just skip over that one for now because I feel like we're going somewhere more important. Okay. Christianity, in essence, was Plato taking over the West. Aristotle was buried. Quite literally, his books could not be found for a long time, and the ideas of Aristotle were buried deep.
It was the rediscovery of Aristotle that sparked the Renaissance.
Sure, Aquinas, it kind of brought Aristotelian logic into Christianity. So even though it was still Christian, there was now. Hold on, but now we need to use logic. So in essence, even God himself is being scrutinized. Even his own existence is being put on trial. So that ultimately, the way I understand it, kind of began the process of getting religion out of the West, at least defanging it. There's a word.
Okay, this is a long one, but first, Sargon's claim that arrogance or hubris is something innate in human psychology is wrong. Nobody has to give in to that, or even feel it. But second, this idea that Christianity was a reaction to, again, the excesses of Roman pride, that is wrong. Now, there is an interplay between Christianity and Rome. In fact, there's an interplay between Rome, the Roman Empire, the Roman state, and all of the philosophy of the time. Actually, if you look at all of the philosophical schools, you can divide them into two broad categories. The one category represents the great turn inward, and those are the skeptics, hedonists, cynics, and stoics. And you can see all of those represent a kind of turning inward. It's a reaction to the overwhelming Roman state and authority. It's a great cultural loss of nerve. It's a way of saying you can't really affect the world out there, so just be concerned with what you can change. The skeptics had this idea of ataraxia. Skepticism as a way of being at peace. Even Epicureanism. It's not really about self-indulgence or positive pleasure-seeking. Epicurus himself only ate crackers and cheese because he didn't want to enjoy food so much, rarer food, that if he ever ran out of it, he would experience withdrawal. So it's a very negative kind of focus on not feeling pain rather than proactively searching for joy or happiness. So you can see the terms in which all of the philosophical schools at broadly the time of Rome were turning away from the world. Now, the precise nature of the interaction is something for historians of philosophy to figure out, and philosophers to figure out. And I am both of those things, and I'm writing about it in my current book, so you can look forward to that. But the other schools are Neoplatonism and Christianity. And those represent another turning away from the world, but upward. It's a turn toward another world. And so this idea that Christian rejection of pride had to do with the actual evils of Rome, well, it's true in a sense, but that does not make it a correct idea. It was still a false but plausible reaction to another false or bad kind of action. The Roman subjugation of the Jews. Nietzsche talks all about slave morality. Also, that painting, The School of Athens, is by Raphael, not Michelangelo. Next, Sargon's point about Christianity being Aristotelian because Jesus said, give away your possessions. That's bizarre. Aristotle was not some spiritual person who believed that your ideas should be divorced from human flourishing materially. Now, there's some contradiction here. Aristotle says that, having friends and wealth and all this stuff is important to having a good life. But then at the very end, he says, oh, but by the way, the best life is just sitting there in contemplation. This is kind of bizarre, and he also does this in other sections of his writings. And it's actually, there are two plausible cases here. One is that these are just vestigial elements of Plato that were holdovers that he believed, and he's just they're just still in him. And another is that the writings we have are from later people trying to merge the two, and they were just sloppily thrown in at the end. And it is suspicious how these elements are thrown in at the end of Aristotle's writings on these topics. But it's unclear. Possibly this is not what Aristotle actually said, but possibly it is. In any case, certainly overall Aristotle is concerned with this world, and Christianity is definitely Platonic and not Aristotelian, essentially. In fact, Christianity is as at the mercy of the philosophers as anything else, and early on, the great Christian philosopher was St. Augustine, and Augustine was influenced by Plotinus, the greatest of the Neoplatonists, who was, of course, a Neoplatonist. And that form of Platonic Christianity is what caused the Dark Ages. Now, as they mention, after Aristotle came back from his vacation in the Arab world, Averroes, through Maimonides, through finally St. Thomas Aquinas, Catholicism became Aristotelian. Christianity became Aristotelian, which morphed into Thomism, St. Thomas, and eventually Scholasticism. And then during the Renaissance, people rebelled against this calcified form of Aristotle, which was scholasticism, based on Aquinas. And this is why you get a very superficial view. You will find this in a lot of commentators, that the Dark Ages was Aristotelian. I mean, essentially what Sargon is kind of saying here. That the Dark Ages was Aristotelian, Christianity is Aristotelian, and then the Renaissance is Platonic. Well, the thing that gives that plausibility is that the Platonic Church morphed Aristotle into this unchallengeable dogma, and it came to be associated with Aristotle, even though Aristotle was the farthest thing from a rationalist dogmatist who had these ideas that he believed couldn't be challenged. No, that wasn't it at all. He was all about investigating the natural world. But because he came to be associated with church dogma, people in the Renaissance superficially rebelled against him and denounced him. So among superficial commentators, you will see this interpretation, but it's wrong. Christianity and all religion are Platonic. They're all supernatural. They're actually worse than Platonic, because Plato was rational. He gives these ideas a dignity they don't deserve. But yes, essentially religion is mystical and supernatural, and Aristotle is rational and natural. Christianity is Platonic, because Plato ultimately was mystical and supernatural, and it is not Aristotelian. As for Sargon's disapproval of the idea that a sacrifice is not a sacrifice, if there's good reason for it, well, I'll just make this point because Rucka never did. Not that I'm blaming him, maybe they just never got back to it, but the idea here is, and this is like the idea of conflating selfishness with motivated action, what's important is to recognize that there are two kinds of things. This goes to the point I was actually just making about Christianity misinterpreting or misconceptualizing the idea of sacrifice. There is such a thing as investment, which means putting off indulgence now for something better later, and then there is the idea of giving up something now for something worse later. Those are two different kinds of things, and that's an important distinction to make. So this is not semantics. Categorization is important. It's important to understand that there are two kinds of trade, in a sense. You can trade something for something better or something worse, and those are different, and you should understand that. And if you think of sacrifice as including both of those things, you're going to be very confused and make bad choices. So that's the logic behind differentiating sacrifice from investment. It's important to have a concept that identifies the idea of giving up something for something worse. That's what sacrifice is.
It's an afterthought.
When you go into the text of Christianity, there really is nothing in it that justifies religious domination. That seems to me to be a compromise of the fundamental values of Christianity for material necessity.
Well, it doesn't have to. It tells you to be irrational and not to think independently, which in turn will lead
All
us.
religions do that, yeah.
Right, which leads us to whenever irrationality takes hold, which is, spoiler alert, pretty much most of human history, you'll find dictatorial rulers filling the vacuum that we've left open for them.
This is a very important point, and Rucka's right here, and I just want to elaborate a little bit because people get this wrong all the time. And I always like to use this example given by Sam Harris because it is perfectly wrong. Sam Harris says, if you take a bunch of Muslims and put them on an island, and then you take a bunch of Jains or Buddhists or just some invented religion of an actual religion of peace, whose commandments include, don't hurt other people, things like that, then when you come back in 100 years, you would expect to see very different things going on those two islands. Muslims would be killing each other because Muhammad was a warlord, and on the island of the peaceful religious people, you would find peace because that's what they were commanded to do. Now, as I said, this is wrong because of what Rucka was getting at here. Because epistemology underlies ethics. It's the methodology, the method of thinking that matters. If you command someone to accept being peaceful on faith, what matters most in that command is that it was a command to act on faith. The method matters more than the content. This is why religion, no matter its concrete commandments, will always become violent. Because if you rely on faith, if you say reason is impotent, and I get my ideas because I just have them, there is no way to persuade other people. You just have the secret bolt from God, or you don't. So there is no convincing somebody who doesn't believe, who didn't get the memo, the divine memo. All you can do is cut him up with a sword if he doesn't agree. And that's exactly what happens with religion. So this idea that, well, there's nothing in Christianity that justifies this or that bad thing, or violence in general, or political domination, doesn't matter. I mean, there are some things in Christianity, but it's certainly true that Christianity has some commandments that that cut against wanton violence, but those are just speed bumps, and they're not going to, they might slow it down just a bit, they might slow that violence train down just a bit, but it's still going to get to its bloody destination. What matters is that faith is irrational, not what specific ethics it has. Although even there, what's the difference between Christianity and Islam? Christianity says, let your throat be cut. Islam has a little bit more of a balance between let your throat be cut and cut other people's throats. So hardly that much difference, even in ethics.
The thing is, though, going the other way, I think that you're going to end up... This is why I don't think I call selfishness a virtue, because there are definitely going to be times where there are people who are suffering, and it will be a virtuous thing to ignore them.
Why is that?
Because I don't have to give them anything.
You don't have to, but...
And there's no benefit to me to help this person.
Okay, this is a very disintegrated, concrete view of selfishness. The idea that, well, I'm not going to help somebody else because I don't get a payout right now, this very day, that's wrong. Now, it's true, there are certain people I would not help out. I mean, if Barack Obama were drowning, or Richard Spencer were drowning, I would not lift a finger to save them. I would let them die. So it's true. If you're selfish, there's no reason to lift a finger to help somebody who's against you. But there is such a thing as the deserving poor, If I lived in a free society, I actually would donate some small amount of money at regular intervals to charities for the deserving poor, because I want people who suffer random strokes of bad luck. I don't want those random strokes of bad luck to destroy their lives. It would be better to live in a society without that. And I know I benefit in principle from preventing that. And I can't ask other people to do it if I'm not doing it. This is the thing. I can't free ride. Free riding is... The concern with that is so dumb. You can't poke a hole in the universe and then expect it not to spread. People always have this question of, well, if you're just going on a road trip, right? And you stop somewhere to eat, why tip? Now, I have views about tipping as a concrete practice, but let's just say tipping is justified. Why tip if you're never going to come back to this place and nobody's ever going to know? Because it's a factual issue. It really happened one way or the other. If you don't tip, then what? Are you going to tell everybody else you did if it comes up? Well, that's a lie. So now you're building a lie into your consciousness, and lies spread because reality is one. It's not a bunch of things floating disconnected in a void. The true is the whole. That's what Hegel said. Everything is interconnected. So what, are you going to lie about that? Are you going to tell them the truth? Well, people aren't going to want to deal with you if you don't pay for your services. Again, it's not just this thing or that thing. It's in principle. If you aren't loyal to reality, bad things will happen. And so if it would be good to live in a society where there were some kind of privately, voluntarily funded safety net for the deserving poor, and contributing to that is worth more to you than a cup of coffee here or there, then you should do it. Because you can't advocate doing it if you didn't do it. You can't lie about it. And if you tell the truth, nobody else is going to do it. And just a million other things that result from the principle of the interconnectedness of all things. I wouldn't spend the money I had reserved for retirement on it, or, some vacation I was really looking forward to. But there's certainly things that I value less than making sure that that kind of safety net exists. So, no, this is a very myopic, concrete-bound. The mistake being made here is not really one of selfishness. It's one about fundamental metaphysical and epistemological unity. If you want to know more about that, look forward to my forthcoming podcast episode, and then essay, and then book, which will probably include a revised and expanded version of that essay on this topic.
But yeah, no, I do agree with you on a lot of this. That's the thing. But there's just something about calling selfishness a virtue that I think puts I think it puts people in the wrong frame of mind. And I'm not necessarily saying that it's wrong. I think it's maybe a deficiency with people themselves.
It's not a deficiency. I think we're born a blank slate. And Aristotle...
I don't think that's necessarily true.
I think to a very large degree we are. Like, again, we've got Steve Jobs and...
Culturally, sure. But, there are always going to be biological imperatives. But not only that...
I think our ethics are not ingrained in us. So.
No, of course not.
Right.
Of course not.
The blank slate idea. Yes, this has come under attack again by all of the usual suspects who are panicked about subjectivism and turning to intrinsicism for their defense. And one manifestation of that is the idea of innate ideas. The idea that we are not blank slates. I talked about this in my recent episode on what's wrong with Jordan Peterson. To briefly recap, tabula rasa is valid. It is crucial. We do not have innate ideas. We do not have instincts. Now, we are born with a mind that has an innate structure. It has cognitive and emotional mechanisms built in. But the content that fills it out and that triggers those mechanisms is not innate. There is no such thing as an innate idea. Hunger is not an innate idea. First of all, you have to understand that hunger even means that you need food, but even if the sensation of hunger somehow triggered some inbuilt reflexive response, like the suckling reflex, not instinct, in infants, that's not knowledge. Now, don't get confused on the idea that, well, what do you mean I felt it? Don't I know that I felt it? Yeah, no, but knowing that you felt it isn't the knowledge we're talking about. And you didn't know you felt it until you felt it, so it's not innate knowledge. The idea is, does the feeling represent knowledge, abstract knowledge outside of the knowledge that you're feeling the feeling? Yes, when you feel hunger, you know you're feeling hunger. But when you're feeling hunger, it doesn't tell you anything else. It doesn't tell you, oh, well, you should cook meat, or you should eat this, or you should eat that. So that's just an elementary mistake some people can make. It's not, I think any honest person will figure out what's wrong with that fairly quickly, but No, there is no such thing as innate ideas. No such thing as gut feeling or intuition or anything like that. I mean, as sources of knowledge, of course, your subconscious automatically evaluates things and sends you up thoughts, but those are not knowledge because they aren't based on a process that produces a grasp of reality. It's entirely possible that you have the wrong premises, or, I mean, everybody's had gut feelings that were wrong. These things do not produce knowledge. They produce feelings. And sometimes the feelings can indicate a direction that turns out to be correct. Often they do. But it's not knowledge, because you don't know that what the feeling is telling you is right. Because you don't know how you got there. Whereas with reason, you know everything that's going on, you know how you arrived there, so you know that it's valid. Anyway, so all this just to say that, yes, we are tabula rasa, even though it's in vogue to attack the idea of the blank slate these days.
But what I mean is, I think that for intelligent people who are very capable of this level of reasoning, yes, it makes a lot of sense. But for people who are not this intelligent, who aren't this capable of a level of reasoning, I think that trying to explain to them how selfishness can be a virtue and not turning them into degenerate moral people, like moral degenerates,
right. So
is not. I think you're going to cause that. And I'm not saying that the values are wrong or anything like that. It's a deficiency in the people themselves, I suppose.
Right.
But this is reality. Like Machiavelli says, we've got to accept men as they are, not how we'd rather them be.
Well, okay, so you're like Plato. You're saying people can't be trusted to think for themselves, and we need to have philosopher kings. Well, here's what. Well,
there are always going to be
philosopher
kings exist anyway. They're the thought.
Well, history demonstrates that in a more rational culture, where people are more free, they tend to really rise to the occasion.
It's true.
And in more authoritarian, less free ones, they're less. If selfishness is properly understood, and look,
that's exactly it. Properly understood.
Right. So that's.
But the people who aren't very bright have trouble properly understanding.
And honestly, I think the more intellectual you are, the engineers of the world are the hardest ones to reach.
Oh,
they're the ones who they've got their head up their ass so far. Like, I mean, just look at the comments section on here. You'll see a bunch of fucking stubborn neckbeards that just won't fucking budge. But it's actually it's the average Joe out there who I think is more likely to understand this stuff.
Rucka is exactly and profoundly correct here. There are ideas, abstract, complicated ideas, that I could explain much more easily to a truck driver than to some idiot who went through the university system. It's like savages are superior to modern intellectuals because they're innocent. Your average tradesman is superior to your average professor. There is a level of stupidity that you can only reach by being confused, by being confused intellectually. It's high risk, high reward. You go into the realm of abstract ideas, it can be very powerful if you get the right ones, or very bad if you get the wrong ones. And I'm not saying this, hyperbolically or to make some exaggerated point. It's true. If you go to college, I actually think most people who go to college end up dumber than your average person who didn't go to college. And the reason is because there are confusions that are worse than common sense you would never get to just based on common sense. It's kind of like, taking a multiple choice test, right? If you just guessed, assuming there's A, B, C, D, on average, you would get 25% correct, right? Every question, you have a 1 out of 4 chance. So on average, you're probably going to get a 25. But now, obviously, to get 100%, you have to know what's going on. But what is also true is that to get a perfectly wrong score, to get a 0, you would have to know what's right and purposely avoid all the right answers. Because just by chance, you're likely to get one question right. So to be perfectly right or wrong requires knowing what's right. This is why, for instance, I regard Kant as evil and not just wrong, because he was profoundly wrong, perfectly wrong, on all of the most important questions. It's like he knew the right answers and was purposely avoiding them. Or advocating their opposites. So in the same way, somebody who uses common sense might make some mistakes, but he wouldn't end up as perfectly wrong as most intellectuals are. Anyway, the second point about, well, most people, they're just not going to understand selfishness because it's just too hard to explain. It's not hard to explain at all. This concept is really easy. I'll explain it to you right now. It's stupid to put two different kinds of things under the same category. Does it make any sense to put Michael Phelps and Al Capone under the same category? No. They're not similar. Michael Phelps worked hard, he went after what he wanted, and he got it. All in a rational way that didn't hurt other people. Al Capone was a criminal, thug, monster. Everything he did was to evade reality. He worked hard to not work hard. He hurt other people, violated their rights. Michael Phelps never did that. These two people are totally different, and their principles of action were totally different. It's bizarre to put them under the same category. It's as simple as that. Then, if you want to, you can go on to further explain that the reason these people are put under the same category, the motivation there is a religious one that is attempting to justify sacrifice. Because they want to create a false dichotomy. They want to say, oh, you don't want to be Mother Teresa? Well, you know your only alternative is to be selfish, which means Al Capone. They don't want that third option. Because if you can say, oh, well, I don't have to be like Al Capone, I can be like Michael Phelps. You know, I can work hard and go after what I want, and that's not destructive. They can't handle that, so they over-integrate. They put these two things in the same category. But they obviously don't belong in the same category. There's obviously nothing about being selfish that is destructive, about being truly selfish. Is it really selfish to lie, cheat, and steal? You know it's not. You can see what's wrong with all those things. And I don't mean wrong in some intrinsic commandment kind of way. You can see why it's actually not to your interest to lie, or to cheat, or to steal. If you cheat or steal, you know you didn't earn it. You didn't have to work hard. You didn't actually achieve what you wanted, so you have no self-esteem. Lying doesn't work, because now other people don't trust you, and you don't trust yourself, and now you have to get into what Peikoff calls conceptual blackout, because all truth is interconnected. One lie means now you have to come up with other lies to cover the first lie. So you have to sacrifice more and more truth to accommodate the first falsehood. So it's just obvious why all of these bad things are not selfish. Everything I just explained is not above any normal person's pay grade.
Okay, let's put aside the question of are people capable of being rational, which I think they are, and I think they will be increasingly...
Why are there so many irrational ones?
Because we live in a highly irrational culture.
Yes, this is correct. This goes back to that menu idea I was talking about earlier. Most people only get to choose from the menu. They don't choose what goes on it. Now, the form in which bad ideas have their influence is that they justify irrational behavior. So, if you resent somebody because he's better than you, just pure envy, pure unjustified envy, in a rational culture, you can't justify that to yourself. But if you have Kant sitting there telling you, well, you know, self-interest is immoral, because that's bound up with the phenomenal world and you're not staying loyal to your noumenal self, so you're actually justified in resenting him. Then you say, oh, okay, yeah, I can continue to do this and I'm justified in it. Or if you say, well, you know, I don't know if I have enough money in my bank account to afford this, but who can ever know reality? I mean, skepticism, right? I mean, anything could happen at the next moment. Maybe I'd be mistaken in my reading of the numbers in my bank account, so what the hell, I'll just spend the money on this, because who can ever know anyway? I'll just fudge things in my direction. This is how bad ideas have their influence. If you take away that air, the oxygen of bad ideas, you get far fewer bad people. You know, there's a reason nobody like Hitler came to power during the Enlightenment. There was no justification for his actions and concentration camps.
I think this is why objectivism never really caught on, because I think that smarter people than me will say something like, it's not comprehensive. That's the thing. It's and this is the thing. It doesn't cover everything. You know, it doesn't. There are certain things that are outside of its purview, and yet Peikoff will say, well, it's a closed system. It's not up for change, and so this is why I don't think I could ever. But maybe I just don't understand it well enough.
Yes, you don't understand it well enough. So I'm going to explain what Peikoff means by closed system, because it's clear that Sargon is misinterpreting it. What Peikoff means by the idea that objectivism is a closed system, which it is that, one, objectivism is a tightly integrated set of ideas. It's not a la carte. It's not a bunch of isolated aphorisms like Nietzsche. It's a systematic, integrated worldview. You know, the politics depends on the metaphysics. Every element depends on every other element. It's all interdependent. So it's not this thing you can just mix and match with. This is why there's no such thing as a Christian objectivist. Now, the other thing here is, it's simply a conceptual issue. When you refer to something, you have to be referring to a definite thing. Objectivism has to be what it is, and what it is the ideas of Ayn Rand, the philosophy of Ayn Rand. If you say, well, that's not comprehensive, there are more truths outside of objectivism. That's true. But if objectivism is any more than that, if objectivism becomes truthism, well, now it's just a duplication of a concept we already have called truth. So you've destroyed the ability to talk about Ayn Rand's ideas in favor of duplicating truth, which is dumb. So that's the problem with that. Peikoff is not saying that objectivism says everything there is to say about everything. Obviously, he's not saying that about physics or biology or art or anything else. Obviously, there are more truths in the special sciences than are covered in objectivism. I mean, objectivism doesn't cover special sciences. It's a philosophy. But even in philosophy, he's not saying it's a closed system and that there is nothing else to discover. That's bizarre. Peikoff himself has a theory of induction that is a further philosophical development. It is not part of objectivism. It was not Ayn Rand's idea, but it is consonant with objectivism. So clearly he does not believe that it's illegitimate to have any, what the Muslims call innovations, or religious people in general call them that. So clearly he's not treating it like a religion and saying, no innovations. You know, innovation used to be a bad word. Well, this is the word of God. It can't be improved. So any change, any innovation is heretical. It's heresy. That is not the idea. The idea is objectivism the concept of objectivism refers to a specific set of ideas. There are more truths out there, even philosophical ones. But you can't call objectives. It can't be this amorphous thing that refers to every true idea, because as I said, then you just duplicate the concept of truth and destroy the concept that objectivism rightly is. So that's all Peikoff is saying. This is an interdependent set of ideas, and for conceptual reasons, it has to be a specific thing, which is Ayn Rand's ideas. And there are more truths to discover, even philosophical ones, but you have to refer to those by some other word I personally say objectivism consonant, because that's what they are. At some point, maybe there will be enough new developments on an objectivist foundation, such as Peikoff's theory of induction and Harry Binswanger's theory of propositions and perceptual systems, and, to be arrogant, my own theory of abstraction and volition and the fully fleshed out relationship between life and knowledge. Maybe enough new truths will be discovered on an objectivist foundation that there will be a new concept that refers to objectivism plus all of those additional truths. But objectivism as a concept has to refer to something specific. It is justified on the basis of both fact and value to have a concept that refers to the ideas of Ayn Rand, and that's what objectivism designates, and it is irrational to destroy that concept. Simple as that.
It is actually objectively true that people can't completely eradicate their biases.
Is that an objective fact?
Yes.
Or are you biased in saying that?
I don't think I'm biased in saying that. I think that
you're being objective in saying that.
Well, no. This is what I mean, right? The world isn't entirely black and white. I mean, it's an empirical fact that you will never be able to find a person who is perfectly objective.
About what?
Anything.
Anything?
Yeah.
Is that an objective statement?
I think so.
So you're being perfectly objective.
It's an empirical statement.
You're being perfectly objective in making that statement, then.
Maybe. I think so.
So it is possible.
Well, in their values. This is an observation. This isn't like me putting forward a normative worldview. I can let's say this is the color white. I mean that's an objective statement. There isn't a human on earth who's going to say that's not white. But that's not a value judgment.
The old objectivity is impossible line. I told you we would get to this, and here we are. So first, the technical epistemological point about the cup. So the first thing to notice is that the cup is not white to everyone. There are colorblind people. So saying that the cup is white is actually ambiguous. You can mean two things by that. You can mean that the cup produces the experience of whiteness that presumably I share with Sargon, although it actually doesn't matter. But that's a really technical point, which I won't get into right now, but you can be referring to that, or you can be referring to the fact that the cup is the kind of thing that produces the experience of whiteness when it interacts with the sense organs of the ocular sense organs of a healthy human being. Now, the fact that it is that kind of thing is objective in the sense of independent of consciousness, which is one valid, although less sophisticated way to use the concept of objective. Yes, the cup is that, regardless of any state of anybody's consciousness. Although the actual perception itself is not objective because that's just a category error. Perceptions cannot be objective or subjective or intrinsic or anything else because they just are. Percepts neither exist independent of consciousness, obviously they are a form of awareness, a form of consciousness. Nor are they objective in the more sophisticated, uniquely objectivist sense of objective, the sense of objectivity as designating a proper relationship between the mind and existence. Well, percepts are not objective in that way either, because there is no such thing as a wrong relationship between the mind and reality. You can't misperceive. Now, you can perceive more or less information. The colorblind person isn't getting as much information as the person with the normal eyes. But his information is not wrong. He's still getting information. That the cup is that kind of thing that appears whatever it appears as to him when it interacts with ocular equipment of the kind he has. So, that's that. But now, Sargon's real confusion seems to be that objectivity is impossible on the moral level, the ethical level, the level of values. Now, it's unclear exactly what his confusion is, I mean, I don't think he would know how to define objectivity if you asked him. I don't even mean the correct way, the objectivist way. I mean, any way. I don't think I think it's kind of hazy in his mind. Again, I'm not trying to trash him, just saying. So, but no, values are objective. Or they can be, anyway. And what the right ones are is objective. I suppose what he's getting at is this idea that morality is necessarily subjective. I know he wouldn't endorse relativism if you put it to him straight, but that is actually what he's implicitly endorsing here. Morality, ethics, is objective because the question of what the only possible standard of value is an objective, factual question, as are all questions of subordinate values, of if-then statements. You see, the trick is, people like Thaddeus Russell do this. They're totally fine with teleological morality. You know, morality of, if you want this, then you should do this. He's fine with that as long as the what you want is subjective. Well, it's not, but well, I can't go into a whole lecture on what people call meta-ethics here, but you can look at my episode on Ben Shapiro and the secular basis for human rights if you're interested in that, and I will do an upcoming episode and essay on this issue. So, if you're interested in that, just look forward to that. And let me know if you're really interested, and I'll move it up on the docket.
Well, it's the thing. That's the thing. It's not that I don't agree in principle, but I again, like in the same way that like communism is a philosophy for ants, I feel like this is like a system for robots.
System for robots. So this is the traditional fallacy that objectivity, rationality, requires the suppression, I should say the total eradication of emotions. That's completely wrong. Emotions are, I think, a necessary component of motivation. That does not mean that they are sufficient or that all action is actually emotional and reason is really just rationalization. No. But emotions are the reward for life. But they're not your guide. I mean, they can give you hints. But if you let emotion lead you rather than lead emotion with reason, you're going to end up in a bad place. Well, you're actually going to end up dead. No place, I guess. But on the other hand, if you have no emotions, there's no point in living. So, there's no dichotomy here. You need both. The question is just which one leads, and reason is what should lead.
Like I said, I'm happy to accept that I'm undereducated on this, but these are the. It's not that I have obviously been reading and I haven't been investigating. Yeah. I've been listening to Objectivists, and I think that again, I think the problem is it works for some people but not others. I think there are people, regardless of how we would like them to be and how it might be best to be, that simply are not. They're too emotionless. They're not really capable of this, and it's because they're human and fallible.
It's not universal because some people are hopelessly emotionalist because they're fallible. I think it's clear he's just flailing around here. I'm not saying dishonestly, just, when you do things like this off the cuff, it's hard sometimes. I mean, I've said dumb things that don't make sense off the cuff. Maybe there's one here, but I don't think so. I think I've been pretty good so far. But one, the idea that this is not universal. No. All human beings are the same in their essential attributes. We all use reason. We all have the same basic needs. So what does it even mean that, well, this works for some people but not for other people? Why? Why wouldn't it work for other people? Yes, it works for everybody. 2, Some people are helplessly led by their emotions. No, people have free will, and unless they are brain damaged in some way, everybody can exert control over his mind and, therefore, actions. 3, fallibility. Well, yes, human beings can make mistakes. That has no relationship to people's ability to control their actions or the relevance of certain ideas to their lives. So that's all I can say about that.
But there's many more independent thinkers today than there were 100,000 years ago, because 100,000 years ago people didn't have time.
No, I don't know if that's true.
Listen,
And that's the thing. That's the thing. I
people,
don't know if that's
people
true.
barely used to even think in the old days. They were just basically living from
Well,
association to association.
They were certainly thinking, but they were thinking on a more immediate level. They were far less abstract.
In a sense,
they were certainly thinking for themselves.
So in a sense, they were more focused on reality.
I actually think that maybe the problem is actually the luxury and contentment of modern life. Like, for example, being a gaming neckbeard, other people were doing the thinking for me. I was playing video games.
Sure.
Whereas if you're more self-reliant and you're a bushman who's hunting game or something, you don't have the choice of
not everyone.
This fashionable, trite idea. I did an episode on this if you want to look it up. It is titled The Anti-Intellectual Diagnosis of the Cause of Modern Strife. I'm not that concerned with SEO, if you can't tell. Alright. Life is just too easy. People don't have to think. That's the problem. Wrong. Wrong. 1, this analogy to the ancient, agrarian farmer. As if today is much different. No, it's exactly the same. If you're just sitting around playing video games, getting a welfare check, or relying on your parents or whatever, you're doing about as much thinking as that ancient farmer did. There's not that much of a difference. It's not like every ancient farmer was a genius who discovered the idea of agriculture. Probably just learned it from other people, and then just put into motion the rote actions, the routine that they were taught. It was much more laborious than sitting around playing video games, but it's not that much of a difference in mental effort. I mean, if you're driving into town to get your welfare check, you still have to, pay attention to some degree, not run into another car, and, you have to see what time to get there and things like that. It's the same kind of very low-level thinking, just less labor. Now, it is true that today we have a higher standard of living. The excess of the rational minds that do work is so great that people have a higher standard of living no matter how little they think today. But that doesn't mean that much. It's true that you can be at a certain level of subsistence such that you are right on the margins, and the slightest change will mean that you die, and that today our standard of living is so high because of the people who do think, that the unthinking people have much greater margin of error with regard to just existing. But that's it. They're still not going to be happy. I mean, happiness is a product of choosing your values and going after them. Yeah, it's easier to just physically continue to exist today, but it's no easier to be happy. Well, it is in the sense that there's more freedom and opportunity, but it's not easier in terms of thinking. You have to think just as much as somebody in the past would have. You don't have to think as much to continue to physically just exist, endure, but you have to think as much as you did back then to be happy and to actualize the potential of your life, to use that cliched phrase. You can achieve more or less, no matter what your context is. The ancient farmer could, and the modern person with $100,000 trust fund can. So, no matter where you start, it's still up to you to make the most of it. This idea that, well, people are just given too much, so they have no motivation, there's no motivation to do anything, that's dumb. I mean, the premise, the unspoken premise here is that just physically existing, that's all there is to life. Wrong. If people understood that they are missing out on a hell of a lot, they're missing out on happiness, the most exalted experiences they can have, then they'd act differently. Just laying around doing nothing is not that different from death, actually. I don't know if you've ever, just done nothing but indulge in recreation for a long time. You start to go numb. There's a contradiction involved. Recreation or rest means rest from something. If you don't work or do something productive, then play, rest, recreation, playing video games, it actually loses its meaning because there's no contrast. There's no differentiation. There is no such thing as just being handed the most important things in life. Yeah, you can be handed basically a basic level of subsistence, but that is not even 1% of what you can get out of life. So the idea that, well, people are just given the essentials today and there's no motivation to do more, no.
I'm not suggesting that people don't have the capacity, but the thing is, I can't think of a time in human history where things would have been mostly like you. And even then, I don't want it to be perfect either. Just even that mostly your way and the way you're describing. I think that people are too easily influenced by emotions.
There is a time in history like this. It's called ancient Greece. The average person was actually much more interested in the philosophical debates going on than you might think back then. This was like a public thing. Like, people were interested in it. Plato wrote dialogues for people. They were readable by people. He didn't write technical academic trash that nobody can read. He wrote philosophy for human beings. In ancient Greece, people were rational. So, and of course there are other examples. Rucka goes into them. America used to be more this way. I mean, he talks about the second half of the 19th century, but even early America, the literacy rate was astounding. Just read those old letters. It was something like 98%. But read those old letters. They write so eloquently. And their thinking is so sharp. This idea that, well, it's just, you're never going to get a society of rational people, that is dumb. Nietzsche pointed this out. The reason you have to, one of the advantages of studying history is so that you don't fall into the trap of thinking things have to be the way they are around you. Now, if you look throughout history, you will see there's ancient Greece, there's the Middle Ages, there's the Islamic Golden Age, and there's the Islamic world now. Vastly different societies are possible. What determines that is what philosophy holds sway. This is something that really annoys me in media. I hate this in RPGs and TV shows, and McDonald's commercials have this vibe. It's just this vibe of everywhere, every place on Earth is the same. Rubin talks about this. Everybody talks about this, but Rubin's just the one I heard most recently, Dave Rubin. Everybody just wants the same stuff. They all just want, a decent job, make some money, go on vacation, send their kids to a nice school, have some sex, have some good meals. Wrong. Not everybody wants that. And isn't it ironic how I, the enemy of diversity, actually love diversity? It's so boring to pretend as if every culture on Earth is the same and everybody wants the same thing. That's why I hate the McDonald's commercials I mentioned, because they show all kinds of weird multicultural people, and they're all smiling and doing the exact same stuff. No, I'm pretty sure those brown-skinned people are not interested in the same things I am. I'm not being racial here. I shouldn't have said brown-skinned, I guess, but those people in China or wherever. You know, people in another culture. They're not interested in the same things I'm interested in. Now, they could be, but they're not. In fact, there are different cultures. There are right now across space, and there have been across time. And when you get rid of that, it destroys all of the interesting questions in life, such as what creates a good culture or bad culture. Anyway, that's the last bit of this I'm going to comment on. This took a long time to do. Maybe the next thing I comment on won't be an hour and 45 minutes. Anyway, if anybody has, feel free to send me suggestions, things you want me to comment on, if you thought any of this was valuable. I am always happy to talk and explain things. I love it. I also like to hear the sound of my own voice now. I used to hate it, but I guess familiarity makes the heart grow fonder. So, anyway, that's it for now. Hope you enjoyed it, found it valuable. I put out new episodes of my podcast on Mondays, sometimes technically Tuesday morning, but I'm regularly putting out content, so if you like this, just stay tuned. Alright, bye.